Hey everyone, welcome back to DungeonBrew. We are continuing our Strongholds series, and today we're going to be talking about Druids. Stay tuned.
Welcome to DungeonBrew.
Hey everyone, welcome back to DungeonBrew. We are talking about Druids Strongholds here today. We have already gone through a few classes, barbarians, bards, and clerics, and next week is going to be fighters. But today we're talking about druids and groves. So Joshua, would you get us started with what that looks like?
Yeah, the interesting thing for me, I think, especially with Druid Groves, is that anytime they're involved in storytelling, they always seem to have like their own narrative thread that always exists within the story. Like they have some level of importance and they're hard to escape from. So when I think of Druid Groves, I guess out of the gate, I usually think of a place that's either sacred in nature or corrupt in nature that is impacting the surrounding region wherever this particular place is being built. Now, for druids, we talked last week about how they oftentimes have this religious kind of like theme to them in some way. I also think of them as being like a growth stronghold as well, where you have or a residential stronghold where there's people that are coming and living and staying and practicing and engaging with members of their sect. But in and of itself, when you're thinking of a grove as a stronghold, it's a place that I think is impacting the region around it, that either is focused primarily on like this sacred growth or this corruption that's impacting this entire region or this entire land. It's a little broad, but that's where my mind goes.
Well, and that's an interesting point, though, because druids, like most of the classes we talk about, it really depends on how the class fits in within the world building to some degree. But a druid grove, I can definitely see that as being like this religious type place, particularly if you're talking about a tribal style, or a village or something like that, or nomadic people who will go and see the druids for healing and for rest and reprieve and succor. And then you also have, like you said, the corrupted version of the grove, where this is the dark point part of the forest, no one goes there. This is the swamp where the hag lives. Those types of areas really aren't quite as welcoming, and then you don't have that same kind of comfort and residential style homeliness, but they definitely both affect the region, I think, in the way that you're talking about, and it makes the stronghold and the world feel more vibrant for having them both in together in the way that they're put there.
They do, and I think this is something that I like to consider as we kind of break this down and look at how we would perceive different groves in our world, whether it's being built from the player character, built from a non-player character, or built from an antagonist within that world. As you're approaching this conversation with your player character that is wanting to either inherit a grove or take over a grove that's already in existence or build their own, is recognizing what type of influence that's going to have on the region and how that's going to impact the game as they kind of step into a role of being maybe the archdruid of this grove, and what their intent is for how that's going to impact the world around them.
Right.
It's so well imbued in just religion and magic, it's got to have some type of impact.
Yeah. And, I mean, the style of it, too, is something that I think that should be addressed. And we talked about in the previous video with clerics in particular, the domains and then the options that come in with how that might influence the appearance or the development of the grove. I think the same thing is true based on the circle that the druid is affiliated with. So a circle of spores druid is going to have, it's going to be more of the swamp maybe feel with the kind of the dank, dark, musty type area, but it could very well be some kind of cavern as well if you're talking about molds and funguses and lichen and that type of thing that grow on cavern walls. You have Circle of Moon, where you're probably going to be a more bestial style grove. There you might see, wild animals abound in that type of grove. And then you also have Circles of Stars, where it's like you have to have something that's open to the sky above. You can't necessarily have the grove itself or the druid stronghold located within a cavern, unless that cavern is something where it's like it's got this open hole in the cavern ceiling that allows them to be able to view the blood moon when it passes over and that type of thing. But I think you can get really creative with those nature elements in building a grove to make them unique.
And I think that's probably the primary thing that calls to me when I'm looking at groves is what nature elements are going to be included. Because whether or not I go more towards the dark end or the light end of how this grove is constructed, are certain elements that I always consider putting into them. Maybe like sacred stones or sacred trees in some way, where you might be paying homage or going to a place for meditation or prayer. Maybe an apothecary or something like that, or a place where we can go and gather plants and herbs and utilize them for some sort of creation. And then something like maybe a scrying lake or a scrying pool where you can go and look at things into the future or things in the past or things that are currently happening within the world within that grove. And I really like those types of elements that set it apart from other strongholds that you might build for other classes. Not to say you can't have those things, but I think they so well fit within this particular stronghold.
Yeah, and I think one of the struggles with this stronghold, probably more than any other, is like that investment opportunity, because it becomes difficult sometimes, I think, to process through the idea that you have to spend gold or something like that in order to be able to develop the expansions or the additions or whatever it is within the stronghold. And I think that sometimes that is something that you can translate into other areas where maybe it's a bartering aspect, and they're not necessarily spending gold on the expansion. They're spending gold on the materials that they would need in order to make the expansion necessary. They already have the cave. They already have the circle of trees that form into like this perfect ellipses, perfect ellipses that is necessary for specific ritual type magics, and they're standing stones. Those things are there, but what they're wanting to include into that are some particular elements, whether that's gems that have to be buried underneath the ground to be able to make sure that they're returned to the earth, and the rituals that are performed within that sacred area are done correctly. And there's a variety of ways that you can kind of make that make sense narratively, so that the druid can invest into their stronghold in a way that makes sense.
And I think the other challenge, which you're kind of hinting at, is also finding ways for this particular stronghold to bring in income to be able to afford those growth opportunities. Because when I think of a stronghold as a grove stronghold, I usually think of it as being self-serving. Most of the things that are there are providing for whatever is happening. You may be having farms, or you're having sacred tools that you're utilizing for the populace there, for the people there that are living off the land in nature, and it's self-serving. So you're not looking at ways to essentially sell stuff or take it outside of the grove to bring in income to afford those things. But it might be worth a conversation with your player, if you're building this for them, about how they're going to maintain some connection with the outside world and be able to grow and expand this place that they've decided to build from, which it may be collecting herbs and making health potions and sending them into, another region or another local city to help take care of the populace there. Or maybe they do healing events around the grove in adjacent regions to clear disease or to cure the inflicted, or to even advise certain councils that they receive income from in order to have protection for their grove, and also help others deal with, whatever diplomatic relations are going on within the area. Something that you have to be creative about how are they going to make money so they can afford to grow their grove.
Yeah, and that's kind of a thing that's probably true in most strongholds. Like, where is the income coming from? Which I think sometimes you just think about, they're adventuring, they have adventuring gold, and they spend this on expanding it. But we had talked about how noble strongholds would be capable of charging taxes. Religious strongholds are capable of commanding tithes. You could do the same thing with a druid grove, particularly if it is the primary religious institution for the region, so that local villagers go and see the druids, or the druids visit local villages, and they accept tithes for some of the work that they do. Now, and of course, the other option for something like this would to be just kind of like hand wave it and say, listen, expansions don't cost you money. Development of the stronghold doesn't cost you money. It just costs time. But you also can't earn anything, which might make a little bit more sense, again, narratively, because the druids don't really want material wealth, and they don't really need material wealth in order to be able to convert natural structures into the idealized version of whatever it is that they're wanting to do within that stronghold. So it's really one of those things where you kind of have to make an executive decision on how does the Grove stronghold operate within the world.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how much I have more to add about player character strongholds around druid areas. I'll be honest, my own experience in building them has been limited. I currently have a druid in our current campaign that we're running that has been messing with groves and strongholds, and that in of itself has been a new and engaging challenge for me. But in regards to building strongholds that are druidic in nature for NPCs is something that I do have a lot of fun with. And it is something that I've done fairly frequently. And again, my primary piece with that is making sure that it's somehow influencing the region around. That's a huge element because I like that in the story piece. But what do you do, John, I guess, to build that NPC stronghold for a druid? Where's your starting point? What are some things that you take into consideration?
It's unfortunately that you pushed that question to me because I can provide an answer, but honestly, the recent one that you did in our game, I thought was quite well done, and I was going to direct the question to you because I wanted you to talk about that building process. But briefly, the Druid Stronghold has to have a command of the region to some degree. Generally speaking, it is some kind of gathering place, whether that's for other Druids who are in the region, or like we had talked about a couple of times, other villages or leaders within villages, they would come there. I often think about the Baldur's Gate Druid quest, where you're going to clear out a corrupted Druid coven. And one of the things that they have there is they dispense justice by basically having contestants fight in a pit to determine who is going to be the leader. Now, this is overthrowing an antagonist Grand Druid and replacing them with someone else. But those types of conflict resolution seen in the Druid Grove would be definitely something that I would look at, where major issues or major conflicts, you go and see the Grand Druid, and the Grand Druid dispenses justice based off of whatever metric you want to use for how they think it's appropriate. It could be a trial by combat. It could just be that the Grand Druid is wise and is able to discern what is best in this type of situation, and it's not quite so barbaric. But having that as this central hub, particularly for a non-developed region. I mean, you're not going to see a Druid Grove normally with a massive city, but it does make sense kind of in wilderness types areas where that's the best religious and or political leadership that they have.
And I think that with the Druid Grove especially, it does have strong elements of political and religious influence. And for that reason, whenever I'm building these, whether for the NPC or the antagonist, I really stick strongly to traditional, ritualistic types of engagements that are kind of solidified in history and in their maybe unwritten laws for how things are going to be incorporated. It's like we've done this for thousands and thousands of years, and we're going to continue to do it this way because that is the right way of doing it. And I think having those written out and having those procedures or processes or what have you kind of solidified before you bring your party into that place is extremely important.
Yeah, and if I'm correct in thinking, oftentimes historically, druids were more narratively focused in terms of their passing on of lore and stories and wisdom and all those things. It wasn't really something that they wrote down. It's oral tradition. There we go. So they have more of an oral tradition where information gets passed one generation to the next word of mouth. It's not something that goes, this is the Grand Druid textbook of how to druid. So those things I think are interesting as well, where you consider how that feeds into the way that they view the world, because time and perception are altered when you're in an oral tradition, and it's just like, well, my father's 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 father told me this, versus having something that's written down in word of law, because then it's more concrete, and it almost makes the age of a thing more concrete as well, because it's a visible text that has existed for a period of time.
And I think that is the primary focus, at least for me, when I'm bringing my party into an NPC Druid Stronghold, is to have that really apparent when you come in. There is individuals that are using that type of language. They're referring to things that have long been past. They're referring to this ritualistic, traditional type of things that need to occur. You walk in, you take off your shoes, you look into the scrying lake, and if it's not you looking back, you walk back out of the grove. Right. If it is you, then you're seeing your true self, and now you can pass on through. Yeah. And it's things that are kind of embedded in myth, it's embedded in superstition, and it's mostly embedded in that narrative oral tradition that has been long-standing in that region for a long period of time.
Yeah, and similar to what we talked about again with cleric strongholds, this becomes this ancient language, this language that ties people together throughout this region. Everybody who goes and speaks with the Grand Druid, or everybody who goes and seeks wisdom or seeks reprieve from the outside world within this grove has a connection to it. And if you're traveling around that region, you become connected to the other people who are then connected to the Grand Druid. It becomes a great hotspot for quests and for the connections and the eventual build-up that you would need as a player character to eventually develop your own stronghold in that region. And this doesn't necessarily have to just apply to druids, and it's the same thing with the clerics in the previous video. If you are a barbarian who is passing through lands ruled by a Grand Druid, then you are going to be seeking permission from the Grand Druid in order to overthrow the corrupted clan chief of one of the villages that are nearby so that you can develop your own stronghold near the Grand Druid. That NPC connection is important when it comes to developing strongholds, not only for druids, but for any player character. And not only for druid strongholds, but for any stronghold. An NPC stronghold is an excellent place to begin your own stronghold building career.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Hey, by the way, if you guys are enjoying our content, enjoying our conversation as we're diving into strongholds, make sure you're hitting the subscribe button, hit that little bell so you know when our next video comes out. And I'd like to shift the conversation just a little bit before we wrap up and talking about the antagonist Druid Stronghold. Specifically, I know that a lot of these things we're talking about are going to be similar for that, right, but also talking about how lair actions might be included within this. I know when we think of going into an antagonist stronghold for druids, we're usually thinking about that corrupt element. It's the old hag in the swamp, that is bringing in these deformed, mangely diseased beasts that you're having to fight. That if they cut you, you're going to turn into a werewolf or some shit. But you could also have this set up as a positive place, or a place that's sacred in some sense, where you have fae or other types of creatures that are impacting you. I'm kind of going two separate directions here. One, it could be the growth process of, plants or fungi or what have you, but it could also be a fae where it's an illusion type of magical place that could disrupt your senses in some way as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. We're talking about antagonists, types of strongholds that are antagonist strongholds, talking about lair actions, talking about the viability of various enemies or what enemies you might face in these types of strongholds. So the first thing that I think of when I think of going and getting a druid stronghold for a PC, and there's an antagonist that you have to defeat in a stronghold, I immediately jump to hag, just like you said, which I feel like you've played with me long enough. You know that I love using hags. They're in almost every campaign that I run. They appear all the time. I love the lore. I love the idea of them. And I love that there is so much built into that monster that I feel like lacks in many other monsters. There's a vibrancy there. But the same thing extends to fae, like you mentioned. And fae they're not necessarily good or evil. I mean, they can be. There's good fae and there's bad fae, but most often fae is a chaos type thing. So this might be a situation. Hags, you go defeat the hag because the hag is doing bad stuff to the region, right? Right. The fae is a situation where it's like you have this cadre of sprites that have taken up residence in a local forest, and you have to go deal with them in some way. You're not necessarily killing them, but you have to some way bargain with them or deal with them in a way so that they're no longer causing trouble for the nearby village, because the brownies are coming in and causing all the milk to spoil, and they can't, the village is in dire straits because they don't have milk anymore, or the sprites are coming through and they're tying together everybody's shoelaces every single morning, and so they're having trouble with this because everybody keeps falling over, just causing chaos in the region. And so the druid is coming in to bring order to the chaos that is the Fae, and establish a potential stronghold in that forest, not necessarily eliminating the Fae, but maybe just bringing them in order so that they're a cause, they're a source of good rather than a source of chaos, or a source of order rather than disorder. I think that there's a lot to do there with the Fae aspect of it, and I think that could be really fun.
Yeah, my thought too, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but you can have so much fun with these concepts of where the magic of certain creatures that exist within strongholds has a lingering effect on a region and impacts a region, even against the intention of those magical creatures that exist. Just from them being in existence in an area, you might see there being residue that essentially branches out, magical residue that impacts towns and cities and placements. And there's also things you could be utilizing where, like, maybe the stronghold is built within a forest where there's ironwood, and a particular city needs that ironwood in order to craft their weapons because they're warring with another city outside away from that. And you have to go in and build a stronghold to be able to regulate that ironwood to grow more groves and more forest area, and only give certain amounts so that you're not destroying the populace in the region and the creatures that exist within there. There's so many fun ideas of how you can kind of attack this or go to address it from this standpoint of looking at nature and its impact on civilization rising, or just how it's impacting other civilizations that exist within the area. Yeah. But I like this concept where you're saying that the antagonist doesn't even have to be so much of an antagonist directly, and I think that this does give you more of that variability, which kind of takes you back to old school D&D, where the druid is very neutral. Yeah. There's a neutrality, there's a balance that you're trying to keep, and antagonist in this sense very much can fit within that, but it forces us, or it challenges us to think more about a process than I think what some other options give us when we're looking at classes.
Yeah. Man, we're already really long into this video, and I could just continue spitballing. If you haven't, I'm just going to pitch this. If you haven't read the Demon Awakened series, and I don't think that that's necessarily the name of the series, but the series by R.A. Salvatore, where he talks about redcaps and the small winged elves and stuff like that. It's fascinating when you want to talk about something like the influence that the Fae can have on a region and the importance of where those types of creatures fit in. I might talk about that one a little bit more when we get to the Ranger video, because that seems applicable, but very good resource, very good series of books to talk about this type of thing. But yeah, I think real quick, let's talk about lair actions, and then we can wrap it up. I think for lair actions with druid strongholds or druid enemies in particular, like the antagonist stronghold druid, I think that those are a little bit easier to tackle because, again, you can look at hags in 5th edition. There's a variety of lair actions that already exist for them. Very powerful Fae have similar options where they have a number of lair actions that are viable and make sense. And when it comes to things like what does the PC gain potentially for lair actions within their own stronghold, I would go by Circle. Circle of Moon is going to be calling in animals to aid. Circle of Land would be calling animals to aid potentially as well. Circle of Spores, you might have these poison clouds that develop, or other things that are going to come in from, or they might be calling in like myconids. They might be calling in various molds to their benefit, or they might allow those molds to populate throughout their stronghold that just provide this general barrier against enemies that would approach them. I think that really there are a huge variety of options for lair actions when it comes to druids, and I feel like it's better supported than maybe some of the other ones that we've talked about so far. I don't know. Is there anything that you have to add, or any other ideas you have for lair actions?
Not really in terms of resources. I think those are all excellent places to start at. I know when I do consider lair actions again within a druidic stronghold, I'm oftentimes thinking of things that are not necessarily hurting the characters or bolstering the characters as much as it's kind of leveling the playing field or just like stalemating. It's things like Entangle where I'm not holding you in place, or things where I'm like stunning you, or I'm dazing you, or I'm holding you steady. It's and like bringing that stagnant comatose almost that's impacting them, which again I think kind of echoes that neutrality theme that you're looking for.
Yeah, I really like the idea of the Entangle. I mean, just Entangle, initiative count 20, Entangle pops up in a section of the area, and anybody who gets grabbed, it only lasts for a round, because the next initiative, you go on to the next lair action. And you could also do some of the same healing options as well, depending on the type of circle, where it's like you provide some kind of rejuvenation or reinvigoration because you're within the Druid Grove, so... All right.
That's what I have. So thank you guys again for hanging out with us. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, and we'll talk to you all next time.
DungeonBrew.